Whenever we take a deep dive into the story of Final Fantasy X, we realize it's not just a game, a classic heroic journey. It's a structural tragedy. And at the very center of that structure, holding up the weight of 1,000 years of suffering, is Lady Yunalesca. To understand her choices, we have to go back to the beginning. 1,000 years ago, Spira was a battlefield. On one side was Bevelle, with absolute technological supremacy. Machina weapons, tanks, and automated artilleries. On the other was Zanarkand, which relied entirely on its summoners. The leader of Zanarkand was Yevon, Yunalesca's father. He knew defeat was inevitable, and what he did next was the act of a desperate man who refused to let his culture die. He used the survivors of his city as faith to create Dream Zanarkand, a perfect, eternal copy of the city. To protect that dream from Bevelle, he wrapped himself in gravity and power, transforming into sin. Now, we've already done a deep dive into the specific mechanics of how sin functions and the sheer scale of the devastation it brought to Spira's history. I'll leave a link to that video in the description if you want to catch up on the full context. The core problem was that the process consumed Yevon. He ceased to be human and became a pure instinct for preservation. Sin didn't just protect the dream. It began to erase any trace of Machina civilization in Spira. The world wasn't just saved, it was condemned to a cyclical apocalypse. This is where Yunalesca comes in. She was married to Lord Zaon, a guardian who loved her deeply. When the world began to crumble under the weight of sin, Yunalesca didn't choose absolute despair. She created a solution: the final summoning. The logic was simple and cruel. You take the one you love, one with the deepest bond, and sacrifice them to become the faith for the ultimate Aeon. Yunalesca sacrificed her own husband. She turned Zaon into the very first Final Aeon, an entity that lore often identifies as Paragon. In terms of sheer power, he was the blueprint for every Final Aeon that followed, a massive, golden war machine designed for one single purpose: to pierce the armor of sin. She achieved the first calm, but the price was her life and the soul of the man she loved. But her death wasn't the end. She became an unsent, a soul that refuses to pass on, remaining trapped in the ruins of Zanarkand for an entire millennium. She stayed there, guarding the empty husk of Zaon's statue, waiting for every summoner who reached the end of the pilgrimage to repeat her devastating ritual. Zaon was the first slayer of sin, but he was also its first victim. By defeating sin, he became the very host Yevon needed to rebuild it. The man Yunalesca loved didn't just die to save the world. He was consumed to become the next monster. But the truly dark part isn't just the sacrifice, it's the systemic lie that followed. After the first calm was achieved, Yunalesca didn't just fade away. She established a grim understanding with the very people who had destroyed her home, the leaders of Bevelle. She provided them with the mechanics of the final summoning, giving the victors a way to manage the apocalypse they had helped trigger. In a brilliant and cruel move of political survival, Bevelle co-opted the figure of their greatest enemy. They took the name of her father, the man who had become the world's ultimate monster, and rebranded him as a deity. This was the birth of Spira's grandest irony. They built the Church of Yevon not out of piety, but out of necessity. By spreading the dogma that sin was a punishment for humanity's reliance on machina, Bevelle forced the world to abandon technology. It was a strategic move. They knew sin was hardwired to target machina-driven civilizations. By creating a religion that forbid technology, they weren't just saving souls, they were ensuring sin had fewer reasons to strike. Yunalesca was the architect of this cage. She knew perfectly well that the calm was a facade. She understood the mechanics of the reincarnation better than anyone. She knew that every time a summoner called upon the Final Aeon to destroy sin's shell, Yevon's consciousness, now a mindless, parasitic entity, would simply jump into that new, powerful Aeon. He would possess it, consume the soul of the guardian within, and use it as a core to rebuild a new, even stronger sin. To Yunalesca, the hope offered by the temples wasn't a path to a cure. It was a palliative, a psychological sedative to give a dying world a moment of breathing room before the next inevitable carnage. She didn't just give them a religion, she gave them a ritual of false salvation for a condemned world. So the question remains, why did she do it? Why spend 1,000 years as an unsent, overseeing a cycle of ritualistic suicide? Yunalesca wasn't a villain driven by a thirst for power. She was a daughter who watched her father's ego and desperation literally consume the world. From her perspective, Spira was already a dead world walking. If the people knew sin was immortal, they would surrender to nihilism. They would stop building, stop dreaming, and simply wait for the end. In her mind, she concluded that humanity lacked the strength to face the naked truth, the truth that their god was a hollow parasite and their enemy was eternal. Those short years of the calm were the only mercy she believed Spira could ever afford. To Yunalesca, a lie that brings a decade of comfort is infinitely better than a truth that brings immediate extinction. This is why, when Yuna and her guardians arrive and declare they are breaking the cycle, Yunalesca doesn't just see a challenge. She sees a threat to the world's survival. To her, taking away the final summoning isn't an act of liberation. It's an act of collective suicide. She became Spira's jailer because she truly believed the cage was the only thing keeping the prisoners safe. A final wall to ensure that only those willing to sacrifice everything could buy the world a few more years of sunlight. In her twisted sense of compassion, she wasn't punishing Spira. She was managing its slow, inevitable decline in the only way she knew how. Yunalesca's tragedy is the tragedy of a mind that stopped believing in the possibility of a future. She chose to preside over a millennium of ritualistic slaughter because she was terrified of the void that the unvarnished truth might leave behind. In her eyes, she wasn't a monster, but the last line of defense against the absolute silence of extinction. She accepted a present of managed suffering because she believed human nature was too fragile to survive without the anesthetic of a false god. By dismantling the tradition of the final summoning, Yuna and her guardians weren't just fighting a boss. They were rejecting the very foundation of Yunalesca's reality. They bet that Spira was strong enough to face the coldness of the truth, even without the sanctuary of a scripted lie. In the end, Yunalesca vanished while protecting a cage, forever convinced that the world outside was more dangerous than the bars she had spent 1,000 years maintaining.